ahora se lo debemos todo a nuestro comandante. Todo se lo debemos, la educación, la salud, todo, nuestra revolución, todo. Gracias, gracias de donde usted está, siempre lo vamos a tener en nuestros corazones. Siempre, porque somos cubanos. ¡Y viva Fidel! ¡Viva!
After 9 days of mourning and his ashes traveling hundreds of miles to Santiago from Havana, a final tour of the island he ruled for more than 5 decades, Cuba puts Fidel Castro to rest. His ashes buried in a cemetery in the city that spawned his revolutionary rise to power. Heads of state, including leaders from Greece, Iran, and South Africa, gathered in Cuba to pay tribute to Castro's record of defiance.
The people and government of the Republic of South Africa learned with sadness of the passing of one of the greatest revolutionaries of our time.
Many people wonder whether Cuban communism will die with Fidel. For all its achievements in healthcare and education, it has impoverished the island and arguably left generations of Cubans without freedoms and opportunities. But Fidel's brother Raul, who has been leading Cuba since 2008, has pledged to continue his sibling's socialist legacy.
En la heroica ciudad de Santiago de Cuba, juramos defender la patria y el socialismo.
Since Raul Castro took over as president, he has made significant economic reforms that would have been unthinkable under his brother. He loosened restrictions on citizens seeking to travel abroad, allowed Cubans to buy and sell their homes for the first time. And now more than 500,000 people are small business owners. But some say the changes have not been fast enough. The government continues to persecute anyone criticizing or demanding an end to the country's one-party rule. Last year, 8,616 people were arrested. Castro's death came just 2 years after Cuba and the U.S. agreed to restore diplomatic relations following 5 decades of hostility. But the looming presidency of Donald Trump and his threats to reverse Obama's concessions until he says freedom is restored in Cuba may test the two nations' budding friendship. Fidel's departure removes the biggest single obstacle to change in Cuba. But will his death actually change anything at all? Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Orlando Gutierrez-Boronat joins me now from Miami. He's the director of the Cuban National Directorate. Orlando, good to talk to you once again. Fidel is dead. The country has shown a few signs of opening up politically, economically. Are you willing to give them a chance? I know you're an opponent of this government. You're an opponent, and you were an opponent of Fidel. Are you willing to give them a chance to try?
You know, we've been waiting since Fidel Castro's supposed retirement, when in reality he always held the power till the very end. And we've been waiting for the past 2 years since President Obama began a series of unilateral concessions to this dictatorship to see some kind of political or economic opening. There's been none. There have been more political arrests, more repression on the streets, more Cubans having to flee the island. There's no sign of political or economic change in Cuba. There's been a spin, there's been a public relations campaign to make it appear that way. But in truth, they've cut back on licenses for independent operators of small businesses. They've cracked down on dissent. There's still people arrested since last week that we don't know where they are. So I haven't seen any sign of opening in Cuba. The reality is that this was not a revolutionary leadership. This was an entrenched, family-run dictatorship that controls a political party, controls an intelligence service, and has kept the nation of Cuba suppressed and subjugated for 57 years.
And while the country might still be impoverished, and yes, they do crack down on dissent, there's a big difference between the Cuba of today and the Cuba of, say, the 60s and 70s, when they had Soviet support, when they were deemed in active danger. Cuba is quite weak right now. Whose interest does it serve to kind of punish it? How would you punish it? Isn't it better to try and bring it into the fold and hope that reform happens that way?
Well, I think you're looking at it from a different prism than I am. I'm looking at it as a Cuban, as part of the Cuban people. The Castro regime is not weak. The Castro regime is a highly repressive regime when it comes to the Cuban people. It has a monopoly over all communications, all education, all armed force. It allows no dissent. It allows no political opposition. Has there been a change in the 60s when they had concentration camps for homosexuals and Catholics and Jehovah's Witnesses and anyone who disagreed with the regime? Well, the regime has lost an ability to repress because of its economic downturn and because it has lost its major patron, first the Soviet Union and now Venezuela. But it hasn't lost the zeal or the will to remain in power as a totalitarian atheist state which walks all over and tramples the freedoms of Cubans. So I don't want to punish my own country. I want to liberate my country from the punishment of the Castro regime. And I think that what we're asking the international community to do is to insist on this small oligarchy that runs Cuba that it's time to open up. It's time to allow political parties. It's time to allow competitive elections. It's time to end the repression. It's time to stop arresting and incarcerating people because they think differently. It's not a matter of punishing Cuba. It's a matter of liberating Cuba from the punishment of the Castros.
There are those, when they try to look back at Fidel's legacy and the legacy of Cuba for the past few decades, they talk of, for example, the more than 200,000 doctors that were sent to countries in need, the free healthcare and education and so on. I wonder, in your eyes, was there anything to admire about him and the country he forged in his image? Anything at all?
I would invite those who cite those statistics to look at the statistics of Cuba in 1959. It was one of the leading countries in literacy rates in Latin America. It was one of Latin America's leading economies. It had one of Latin America's best organized labor unions. Cuba was a country on the verge of takeoff, of development in 1959. Castro led a revolution that promised to restore free elections, free press, competitive political process, a reformed judicial system. He promised that to the Cuban people. What he delivered was a totalitarian state as Latin America has never seen, with over 200,000 Cubans having been incarcerated for political reasons at any given moment in time, with thousands of people executed, thousands more disappeared at sea. The human toll for the kind of poverty Cuba is suffering is enormous. So do I find anything positive about this? No, I find a lot of things positive about being Cuban. I'm very proud of being Cuban. I'm proud of my country, of my people, and of my ethnicity. But this regime has been a horrendous regime. It has the pain it has inflicted on Cubans, how it's divided the Cuban nation, how it has set back Cuba in its drive to development are simply awful. And when you look at around the world, you see wherever there are Cuban exile communities, they've done well. They've developed. Cubans have an innate business sense. They're hardworking people, except in Cuba. In Cuba, we've been impoverished because this hardline communist regime designed to keep Fidel Castro in power has drained our national energies.
And you believe that the Cuban government has made no concessions to deserve normalization. There are fears, we don't know what his policy will be, but there are signs and fears that President-elect Trump will tear up President Obama's agreement with the Cubans. Do you want that?
I think the agreements that Obama reached were not with the Cubans, it was with the Castro regime. That's a different story. It's an entrenched oligarchy that rules Cuba with an iron fist. I think President-elect Trump, his statements have been on the side of standing up for human rights and democracy and freedom for Cubans. That's what we want. And the Castro regime has to acknowledge the fact that just as political negotiations have taken place all over the world, they need to recognize the political parties, recognize the opposition, and through negotiations reach multi-party elections, release of political prisoners, and carry out or begin a transition to democracy in Cuba. We've seen that throughout the world. We saw it in South Africa, we saw it in Poland, we saw it in Chile. That is the way towards the future. And under a regime of freedom, under a regime of democracy, Cubans can have a national home, and we can dedicate our energy to building up our country.
You mentioned South Africa very finely. Do you understand why the South Africans celebrate Castro? Because he helped overthrow apartheid? Might that be one plus point in the man's legacy?
I think Nelson Mandela was a man who was very grateful to those who helped during the liberation struggle against apartheid. But you also have to know, Nelson Mandela did not apply in South Africa what Castro applied in Cuba. In South Africa, there's a free press, there are free political parties, there's an open society at Bender where there's a constant debate and a free discourse, there are labor unions. It's a free society. What Castro imposed in Cuba was a dictatorship, a totalitarian state that practices apartheid against Cubans themselves. Until very recently, Cubans couldn't even go into hotels in Cuba. Only foreigners were allowed. There are hospitals in Cuba where Cubans can't go into, only foreigners can go into. So do I understand Mandela's gratitude? Yes, I do. But Mandela did not do in South Africa what Castro did in Cuba.
Orlando, good to hear your thoughts. You have a fascinating perspective. Orlando Gutierrez-Boronat. Hope to talk to you again in the not too distant future. Bye-bye.